Okay, hello everybody, and welcome. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to come in, just to get set. So Laura, congratulations on the paper last week.
Thank you. It's a long time coming.
Yeah, it looks really interesting. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's on the to-do list.
Good. It's open access, so make sure you do.
Definitely. Okay, a few more seconds and then we'll get started, I think. So hello to those of you that are joining us. And welcome to, this is the fifth University of Suffolk Learning and Teaching webinar series of the 2022-23 academic year. And today we welcome a great colleague and friend, Laura Polly, to the series. Now, Laura is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Suffolk. She's currently doing a PhD exploring individuals' lived experiences of sex work and pornography through a feminist lens. So Laura is going to present this talk, which is entitled Developing Praxis, Using Lived Experience Narratives as Teaching Pedagogy. So Laura will talk for about 45 minutes, with the remaining time of the hour webinar allocated to questions and discussion. Laura, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and over to you.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Phil. Hi, everyone. As Phil kindly introduced, my name's Laura, and most of you know me as a lecturer in criminology here at Suffolk. So I'm going to be speaking to you for the next sort of hour about this concept of developing praxis and how we can do this using lived experience narratives. So I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by lived experience narratives in this context a bit later on, and I'll just make a start from here. So, as a bit of an overview, thinking about the context of higher education, there's really big drivers towards a number of strategies that impact how we teach, what we teach, and how we engage students in different sorts of content and contexts. At the moment, there's a really big push for employability, and to maintain positive graduate outcomes and get students into graduate level degree relevant positions. As well as this, the pandemic's changed the way that learning spaces exist. There's been more discussions around how we engage students using different formats of delivery and how we can navigate complex topics in ways which don't intimidate or disengage our students. Further, higher education, although it predominantly exists as an institution which delivers education and ultimately awards degree level qualifications, these are also spaces which offer opportunities for socialisation and networking. As a lecturer, I've seen a recent push towards ensuring we create opportunities for networking between our students and professionals or organisations relevant to their subject area. Some of this connects to the wider employability strategy, whilst more holistic considerations push towards that socialisation and learning through practice, or praxis as I refer to it today. So before we really get started, I just want to go through some definitions that I use when I'm talking about this specific research project. So when I'm referring to lived experience, I'd like to distinguish this from practitioner experience. So traditionally, particularly in the disciplines that I teach around criminology and sociology, we really love to incorporate practitioner experience into our curriculum. So that is getting people of specific professions to come in and speak to our students about their role and what a day in their life looks like, how they got into the role, so the sorts of entry criteria and what they can expect to experience in that role if it's something they want to go into. And that exists really in this realm of employability. However, what I'm talking about today is different to practitioner experience in terms of lived experience. And this is lived experience of a particular phenomena, culture, or identity, okay, that's not necessarily a professional identity. And when I'm referring to lived experience sessions, I'm thinking about these individuals with lived experience sharing their reflections, their opinions, their perceptions, and most importantly, their experiences of this particular thing. So this research project that I'm going to be sharing the findings with you all relates to the lived experience of sex work and a lived experience session with a woman who formerly sold sex. Okay. Oh, so it's first perhaps wise to consider the importance of this form of knowledge exchange. So this form of using lived experience as a learning tool, which is quite different to practitioner experience in terms of where it's placed within that higher education strategy. So practitioner experience clearly sits within employability and networking strategies. However, lived experience may on the surface appear to fit more abstractly into the curriculum. So I'd like to propose that whilst lived experience sessions don't have distinctive abilities to deliver graduate outcomes like their practitioner counterparts do, they have important impacts on students in regards to developing knowledge and understanding the ways in which theory can be applied and understood within the ontological realities of individuals and groups who hold that experience. So literature tells us that lived experience can allow humans to suspend their preconceptions and reorientate their attitudes towards the experience based on how they absorb it in that session. It can enable the removal or reduction of discrimination within specific groups or individuals. It can serve as a form of activism, redressing cultural perceptions and dominant ideologies that can lead to this discrimination. It also assists in demystifying myths, uncovering realities, reducing fear, and working towards a more equal distribution of power between service users and service providers. And it's also an opportunity to integrate this theory with practice, which allows students to develop critical thinking skills, as well as providing students with the space to fully integrate philosophy and an application of that philosophy. Okay, so applying theory into practice. So this concept of praxis that I'll be referring to throughout the session. We really, as higher education academics and group facilitators, recognise the importance of theory within a learning and teaching curriculum. But do we always make it relevant enough to be engaging? Is a question that I've been asking amongst colleagues recently. So students often report that they find theory-based learning as quite abstract and general, and at times irrelevant. So it's difficult to make theory tangible sometimes. Solely says that theory can be perceived as dry and boring by higher education students. And actually thinking about application is really valuable here for making it interesting and tangible. It creates an environment where students can engage with the theory itself while giving it meaning and relating it to practice. And that's where this term praxis derives from. And the important thing here is being able to connect what we think and the knowledge that we're trying to impart on students with what we do in reality and in practice in our various disciplines and subject areas. So this project specifically had a few research aims, but two of them I'll share with you today as the most relevant. And these aims were around whether students perceive lived experience teaching as having a positive or negative effect on their learning, and how students perceive lived experience teaching sessions to be as valuable as practitioner-led sessions. So I was trying to distinguish with this group of students the difference between having a session from a professional experience knowledge exchange opportunity and then a lived experience knowledge exchange opportunity, and thinking about those differences and how they impact on a student's learning. So the methodology for this research project was qualitative in nature and exploratory in approach. I incorporated a mixed methods design that was both qualitative. So I observed a lived experience session, which was delivered by a former sex worker. So the idea here was, I need to teach my students about sex work as a contemporary issue in criminology. And actually, I could give them an academic perspective of sex work, but for me, the best way for students to learn about those experiences and get the reality of that subject and that topic area was to speak to someone who had sold sex. So that's what I did. I arranged for a sex worker to come in and speak to students and deliver or facilitate a session where they shared their experiences and discussed with students the different challenges which sex workers are faced with and the different perceptions and beliefs that come with the realm of sex work. So on top of these observations, I also did some semi-structured interviews with students. So after the session had taken place, the session was about an hour long. Students then sat down with me one-on-one. We did a semi-structured interview where I asked students about their experience, whether they found it meaningful, whether they found it positive or negative, how could this be used more widely in a curriculum? And I got some really good engagement from students about how they thought lived experience could form part of a higher education curriculum and how it has a place in teaching and learning in a contemporary world. So all of the data was transcribed and analysed with an RTA method, and I'm going to share with you some of the key themes that came out of this. So largely, students reacted positively to the lived experience session. So the students that attended and spoke to this woman about her experiences of selling sex reported that it was a largely positive experience being in the room at that time physically. Students reported that lived experience sessions offered the reality of knowledge. So whilst theory could feel quite abstract, lived experience tended to be perceived as that reality. Students also reported that lived experience sessions tended to be more engaging than traditional lectures. I think some of that comes from the experiential way of learning in terms of knowing that the woman in front of them was sharing experience that she had firsthand rather than reporting academic perspectives and paradigms about a particular topic. So the fact it was grounded in real experience and someone's real life really tended to make that more meaningful for students. Students also reported that lived experience sessions actively challenged existing ideas that they had. So lots of students said that they had what they thought was quite a good idea about the realities of sex work. They'd read a lot, they'd listened to podcasts, they'd watched documentaries about the topic. And actually this session was able to challenge some of those ideas and was able to remove some of the stigma or some of the preconceptions that students may have had about people who sell sex before that session. And overall, lived experience was valued just as much as professional experience. So during that interview, I asked students to think about a previous session that they'd had with a practitioner. So for my students that were in this research project, this was a police officer that had facilitated a session about policing in England and Wales. And I asked them to reflect on the differences between those sessions and how valuable each session was. And it was found that students perceived this lived experience session, which looked at the reality of sex work, with just as much value as a practitioner-led session, which still had that criminal justice theme. So from these findings and from my observations, I've sort of thought about how lived experience can become a more widely used part of the curriculum and also become more meaningful. What I found was there were certain aspects of the process that I'd done with these students that I'd done unconsciously, but students picked up on as things that made the session more meaningful. So these were things such as setting pre-readings and doing a sort of mini lecture about sex work before the lived experience session. Students remarked on the sort of debrief we did after the lived experience session, which was around making connections to their assessments, making connections to the content in the module more broadly. And it was these sorts of things that got me thinking, how often do we as higher education lecturers and facilitators bring a guest speaker in, but not necessarily make active ways to make it meaningful? So actually thinking about whether there is a way of facilitating lived experience sessions and using lived experience narratives to get the most out of them and make them as meaningful as possible for a student's learning experience. So from that, I've created this model that I've started using over the past few months in higher education. I'm finding it quite effective, so hopefully I can share a bit about this with you all today, and we can start using it more widely. So existing literature concerning praxis from a practitioner context exists, and this helped me sort of frame a model that we could use for lived experience context and lived experience teaching, as well as that practitioner-led context. So this model has the core aim of being able to make what could be deemed as abstract theory more relevant and assist students in applying theory to real life. So throughout these 3 steps of the model, it aims to take standalone theories and concepts and connect them with the ontological reality of that thing that the theory discusses. In this context, it's sex work. That's the thing that the model was trying to create a meaningful learning session about. So there's 3 stages, which are characterized by context, connections, and creating space. And these aim to make the session and the lived experience as a meaningful and positive learning opportunity, whilst also attempting to promote deep engagement with the lived experience or the reality of the thing, through connecting this with theoretical, philosophical, or conceptual discussions which relate to students' wider learning and can be structured in a way which holds value for assessments. So something I found time and time again when I spoke to students about content in lectures and in seminars and in these guest speaker sessions, whether they were lived experience led or practitioner led, was that students found sessions that were geared towards their assessments as most valuable for their learning. And these tended to be the ones that students engaged the most with. Now, some of that can be argued as quite surface level in terms of being assessment driven in learning and teaching. However, being able to have these deep discussions and deep engagement about lived experience, about theory, about philosophy, and still make that applicable and valuable to assessments seems to be a way to keep students the most engaged. So I'm going to go through each of these stages and unpick them in a little more detail. So firstly, step 1 is all around providing context, okay? So the students reported in interviews that sessions were more meaningful if they had some pre-existing knowledge of the topic. And what I took from that is really we shouldn't be using guest speakers, particularly lived experience speakers, as a way of building really new knowledge for students. So not using it to introduce new topics or new ideas, and instead using lived experience sessions as a way to consolidate learning and to develop different ways of thinking about a topic that is already familiar to students. So in practice, that looked like for me providing pre-readings and an introductory session, which was a bit of a mini lecture to explore the key concepts and theories which relate to the topic, and to create online activities that sort of explore and help students to engage with the academic context of this particular topic. Step 2 was all about making connections. So students reported that they found sessions more valuable when the session facilitator identified connections between that lived experience and the theory that it relates to. So my reflections on that and my recommendations from that are that lecturers should attend and engage with lived experience sessions in order to tease out those connections and assist students in identifying theories or concepts which relate. It's really important to have a presence in guest speaker sessions that isn't simply an audience. It should be an active participator of that session as a lecturer. So what I've done in practice with future practitioner-led and lived experience-led sessions is framing the session as more of a discussion than a lecture. So instead of that guest speaker, standing up in front of the class on their own and speaking through their experiences or their role, it would be both of us, and we would co-facilitate that session to allow students to gain that valuable insight from a practitioner or from an individual with lived experience, while also keeping it meaningful and keeping it related to the content of the module, the relevant theories, and driving towards their assessments. So in practice, I'd recommend short breaks within lived experience sessions. This gives your speaker a chance to reflect and gather themselves And it also gives your students a chance to have conversations with you and allows you the opportunity to identify where these connections to theory can be made and to prompt students to consider how that experience fits with the theory. What we found with students who attended this lived experience session with a woman who formerly sold sex was that some of her experiences really challenged some dominant paradigms and frameworks that existed within discourses of sex work in academia. So actually being able to have those conversations about multifaceted layers of ontology and how different realities can offer very different perspectives on the same topic was a really valuable way of connecting that theory to an experience. And the final step is around creating space. So similarly to making connections, students reported more positive learning experience when there was time after the session to discuss the what, the why, and the how of the lived experience. So what I've always called it with my students is a hot debrief. So after a guest speaker-led session, whether it is a practitioner or a lived experience individual, we would have a hot debrief where we talk about what we enjoyed about the session, what we found valuable about the session, and we make some mind maps about that key content and those key discussions that were had with that guest speaker so that we can then begin connecting that to theory. So my recommendation, as I've said, is to facilitate that debriefing space, which allows for theory and practice to be connected and discussed as a class. So this is a sort of group reflective and consolidatory activity. And all this takes is to leave space at the end of a lived experience session. Sometimes I've left 15 minutes, sometimes it's been 45 minutes to an hour. And what also feels quite nice for students to be able to do is some consolidatory learning activities after the session, whether that is a short reflection piece or some reading that really carries on nicely from those discussions, just to be able to continue thinking about how those connections can be made between the theory and the experience after the session has taken place. Okay, so essentially, the model enables lecturers and session facilitators to create meaningful learning sessions which not only cover the assessment-related stuff or the seminal texts and key thinkers on a particular topic, but also the ontological reality of the stuff or the thing in question. So lived experience sessions can be great opportunities to consolidate theoretical knowledge with application, or as one participant stated, it makes it make sense. So I thought this was a really powerful quote from one of my participants, thinking about how theory can often not be so tangible and not be so easy to understand in its abstract form, but actually being able to think about that theory in the context of someone's reality and someone's lived experience makes it make sense, which I think is really powerful for demonstrating how big of a learning opportunity lived experience sessions can be. Students also get the opportunity to connect their thinking about a topic with the doing related to the topic. So that connecting that thinking and doing can also be a really powerful way of deep learning. So although this research and related discussions focus on lived experience sessions specifically, rather than practitioner-led sessions, this model can be useful for both and can be useful across all guest speaker sessions to ensure that they're meaningful learning spaces which not only encourage deep learning, but also networking opportunities if they are practitioner-led sessions, or opportunities to have open discussions which may challenge other discourses and ideologies that students already have. Okay, so lived experience sessions as praxis. So I've found as a lecturer that we often identify theory and practice as two separate entities, particularly on courses which have placement or work experience incorporated within them. So lots of courses have modules dedicated to theory and separate modules dedicated to gaining work experience or gaining practical experience that relates to the course. And what I'm trying to do with this model is open a discussion with academics where we identify the connections between theory and practice, and in doing so, establish a meaningful relationship between the two in the hopes of removing this duality associated with these entities. So the three-step model creates opportunities for these connections to be made within a meaningful learning space. This has the potential to clarify that abstractness of theory as standalone discussions and bring together what people do with what people think. Something else that this model does is place value on lived experience in the same way that we value professional or practitioner experience. So thinking about my research, looking at how students perceived a lived experience session with a former sex worker, it made sense to involve lived experience here. And sometimes it makes sense to do this over professional experience. What better way to learn about the realities of sex workers than to learn it from a sex worker themselves? Otherwise, that information they're getting from me is almost third hand, because my experience of that topic comes from academic discourses and concepts and frameworks that exist within the literature. Hopefully, that literature derives from realities and experiences and perceptions of sex workers, but actually being able to get that knowledge firsthand is really powerful. If I want my students to have a realistic but evidence-based opinion on something like sex work, I need to ensure that we don't just involve those academic discussions and we have a more holistic discussion about those experiences of sex work with people that experience them. Okay, so just to sort of summarize my thinking around it, lived experience, in my view, is an integral part of a student's learning journey. To become an expert in your field, you have to get intimate with your subject matter and the ontological realities of those who exist within your field, which at times are multifaceted and layered in terms of experiences and beliefs. To encourage students to be inquisitive learners who can apply theory to reality, as well as engage meaningfully in conversation with individuals who hold lived experience, this model of providing context, making connections, and creating space is really useful. Perhaps an important point to end on is what I believe to be the most important stage of this model, which is making connections. Students perceive theory application as meaningful because of two key reasons. It makes what can be quite dry and abstract more tangible, and it also makes their learning more engaging and more enjoyable to be part of. And creating these engaging learning spaces while still incorporating theoretical discussions keeps learning related to assessments, whilst creating space for discussions to broaden students' knowledge beyond the realms of a traditional curriculum. And that's all from me. So I'm really excited and really happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Laura. That is really, really fascinating work. Please do type some questions out for Laura, anything that's perhaps that you would like clarification on, or something that you're interested to put to Laura. And I think, Laura, while we wait for them to come through, I'll probably ask a few questions. I've been sort of scribbling away manically during that. This is a way of really making theory come alive, isn't it? And I think as working in this environment, we kind of understand the importance of theory. Well, we do, but we're perhaps not always very effective in translating that importance to our students and the sessions that we run. So I'm particularly interested in that facilitator role that you spoke about, as almost that mediator between the lived experience and then the relevance for those students at that particular time in that particular module. Could you just expand a little bit more what that facilitator role looks like in practice?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So the concept of being that sort of mediator between the guest speaker and the students can feel, when I'm discussing it abstractly, quite awkward. So what I've done when I've invited guest speakers in since this research is to ask them if that sort of facilitating is okay. So are you happy for me to co-facilitate with you? Like I'm really clear that I'm not trying to detract from their experience, but what I'm trying to do is make sure the students engage in the best way that they can, and that is to make it as meaningful as it can be to their own learning journey. So I've recently done it with a practitioner. So I've applied the model to a practitioner session where she's delivered this session based on how she supports female offenders once they leave prison, and talking about that role and what the role entails. And usually what that looks like is, letting a discussion run its course, and then at an appropriate time within the session where there's a bit of a natural pause, being able to even just briefly jump in and say, right, do we remember what we said, last week about this particular theorist and their opinions on A, B, and C? Can you see how this connects to this person's job as a women's wellbeing coach? And then you suddenly see those pennies drop in. So the module that I've used it the most in, this module is a second year module. And the feedback I get on this module quite a lot is that there's penny drop moments here, because it's a contemporary issues module where lots of quite seminal theories, these theories that created the discipline that I work within, are applied to contemporary challenges, contemporary issues, and that really makes it make sense. So naturally, the module's quite a penny drop experience for students, but actually lived experience sessions on their own in that module and in other modules can be those penny drop moments. So yeah, just being able to find natural pauses in sessions, make those really quick connections, and then using a hot debrief at the end where you've said goodbye to the guest speaker, they've left the building, and you're able to just quick fire, create mind maps on the whiteboards, on flip chart paper, right, really quickly before all this knowledge slips away, how can we get this on paper? These connections that we've, spoke about quite naturally through the session and through a Q&A with this guest speaker at the end, how can we now make them tangible in terms of the theory and the literature and the frameworks that you will know at this point from that mini lecture or from that pre-reading that you've been given before the session.
Thank you so much. And I guess that's really interesting. So it's almost, what would your thoughts be on almost how open-ended do you keep those sessions?
I think as open-ended as possible. I think while it's incredibly important to allow that person space to share their experience, and that's what we really want from that session, it's only as meaningful as students perceive it to be. And if we know students engage better with things that are geared towards assessments and geared towards the content they need to know in their degree, then that's what we have to try and tailor that session around. So quite often before lived experience individuals come into my sessions, I'll give them a briefing on this is what the students are assessed on, this is what they're going to want to know, and these are the sorts of discussions that might be really valuable for them and might prompt more discussion to make your presenting easier, because you'll get some sort of interactions with the students because they'll be particularly interested in X, Y, and Z. So I think it's just about keeping that communication open, mediating, inside the room and also outside of the room between that lived experience individual and the group of students. So identifying what the students need for their learning, what they want for their learning, communicating that before the session to the speaker, and then being able to debrief about the speaker's contributions and experiences after the session with the students, just to create that sort of cohesive communication from all parties.
That's really interesting. And with the example that you provide about sex work, did you feel like any students went on a real journey of changing so you mentioned about stigma. Do you feel like any students really went on a journey of starting to understand things differently from the session that was delivered?
Yeah, so this was another element of the project. So I shared 2 of the research aims in the presentation, but there were some other research questions around discrimination and stigma and perceptions of marginalised groups. Sex workers tend to be very heavily stigmatised, even in the contemporary world. So actually lots of students said, she wasn't what I thought, she wasn't who I expected. Her experiences weren't what I was expecting. And that was from like all ends of the scale. I had a few people in that lecture who were quite liberal towards sex work and had the view of, if it's consensual, then, I'm pro-choice and pro-women engaging with sex work if that's what they want to do. And lots of them came out of that session almost questioning the ethics behind that liberal approach to sex work, which was quite interesting. So there was lots of surprises, I think, for students, being able to have a really open and frank discussion with someone. I was really lucky that the speaker was very open and set some ground rules at the start of the session, which was basically, there is no question that you cannot ask me. I will answer everything, the good, the bad, the ugly and the gory about sex work. Like, you have no need to reserve yourself, which put the students at ease straight away. So there was this very clear, there are no expectations of you, and there is nothing that you need to reserve. You can ask me anything. You can ask me in an open forum. You can ask me privately at the end, and I will answer honestly and openly. And she did the whole way through. So I was really lucky that we'd had some quite good discussions about boundaries, what she was willing to share. And at that point in time, it was, I'm really happy to share absolutely everything. And those ground rules really put the students at ease in terms of exploring things that may challenge how they think. So yeah, it was an interesting journey for them to be able to think about what they know, think about what they think they know, and then connect that to someone's reality of it.
Thank you. Yeah, extremely powerful. And just related to that, I'll just ask quickly, and then I'll get to some of the questions coming through around confidentiality. And was that sort of negotiated prior to the session as well?
Yeah, so it was, in the arranging of the session, this person who came in and did this session has exited the industry and has been out of the industry for quite a number of years now, I think about 5 years. So she was very happy for her identity to be shared. She's gone on to be a real activist in terms of sex work. She's sort of dipped her toe in academia, and she's now starting to think critically about her own experiences and other people's experiences of sex work. So it was a very ideal case to do this sort of research on, because there was very little concerns regarding safeguarding for students and for the speaker. I've sort of had these discussions about confidentiality with other guest speakers. So this year I've had a former prisoner come in and speak to students, and it's been what are you happy to disclose? What are you not happy to disclose? And being present in that room and entirely engaged to divert questions away from things that just are not up for discussion. But overall, in terms of confidentiality, I mean, if these speakers are willing to come in and speak to students physically and engage with students, then, their identity isn't protected. And that's why choosing speakers is often quite an important task in order to make sure that you're not putting these people at risk, and that they are actively sharing their lived experience of their own volition. And that's something that they choose to do and really enjoy doing, which I guess is also important to convey. A lot of the lived experience individuals that I've had in for sessions have come back to me and said how powerful they found it, being able to speak to a group of people who have some sort of knowledge about their experience, whether it's the reality or whether it's purely academic knowledge. And it was quite a powerful experience and quite a validating experience for people who, in these two scenarios I'm thinking about, were from marginalized groups who have lots of stigma attached to them. They sort of, upon reflection, both contacted me and said, I really enjoyed doing that. And if you need me to come back, I'll happily speak to more students, because I found it really powerful in terms of being able to talk about my experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and being able to, discuss how that connects with what the students are learning. Like, that was a really positive experience for the speaker and the students.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we've got a comment and a question from Alex. Thank you for this, Alex. They say thank you, really interesting, and they can see how this approach really helps students to link theory into the real world. For those who come in to provide their lived experiences, Laura, are they compensated for their time? And have you faced any ethical dilemmas around this?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So there's been occasions where I have invited lived experience individuals in, and it's been voluntary. So they haven't been compensated for their time. And there's been others that have been paid at occasional lecturer rate. So it's very much dependent. It's very much depended previously on the course that this session fits within, and the ability to offer funding at that time. What I will say is, in all scenarios where I've done it, I've been really clear from the get-go of, you know, this is something that I'm asking for voluntarily, or this is a paid opportunity, and that's sort of really clear from the get-go. And if it is a paid opportunity, this is the hourly rate, and of course we will compensate preparation time and things like that. So I've done both. Personally, I always prefer to pay lived experience individuals. However, that itself can come with its own problems, particularly for people who are unemployed and claiming universal credit. Receiving any sort of payment into a bank account can trigger sanctions. So that's something to bear in mind, that paying someone, although feels like the right thing to do, may not always be the right thing to do at all, and can create really negative consequences for them. In terms of their benefits and what finances they have to live on. So that's another ethical dilemma to think about. But overall, I generally prefer to pay people, but I'm really clear from the outset of whether it's a paid opportunity or it is voluntary.
Thank you. And any, I guess more broadly, any ethical dilemmas, any other ethical dilemmas that you've come across or experienced?
So far, no. But that's because I've been really lucky that the lived experience speakers that have come in have been really open and have expressly said that there are absolutely no boundaries and nothing that can't be asked. So navigating ethics has, on my part, been a lot easier because of the openness of the speakers and their ability to quite robustly handle a room and quite robustly manage a room. But I could foresee some ethical dilemmas, particularly with different marginalised groups, or perhaps people who are still in that current experience. So what's interesting about the lived experience individuals I've had in is they are reflecting on former identities. So this woman that came in is reflecting on a former identity of being a sex worker. I've had a former prisoner come in reflecting on their former identity of being incarcerated. So I think these ethical dilemmas would be much more likely to happen if someone's discussing a current identity, and that is an identity that is subject to stigma and marginalisation and exclusion. So, for example, a serving prisoner or a current sex worker, then there would be some massive ethical dilemmas there, which is probably why I've operated on the edge of caution, and made sure that my lived experience sessions tend to be a reflection on former identity rather than current identity, as I think that's quite important for the speaker to ensure that that experience isn't traumatic.
That's really interesting about. So do you feel like with the two examples that you had, there was almost a degree of separation between current identities and previous identities?
Yeah, and there's lots of research, particularly within the field of looking at substance misuse and recovery identities. So different identities that people adopt when they're in recovery from drugs, compared to when they are in the context of addiction and actively using drugs. And lots of people say, particularly in research that looks at drug recovery and identity, that there is this degree of separation between that is who I was, this is who I am now. We see it discussed a lot in desistance literature as well, thinking about the context of people with convictions. Lots of people who have convictions and have past experiences of offending behaviour often report that I'm not the same person as I was back then, and that is a completely different version of me. And therefore, I'm very happy to reflect on that former identity because it has no impact on who I am now, as a desisted identity rather than an offending identity.
That's fascinating. There's so many layers to this. It's incredible. So please do keep those questions coming in if you've got anything to ask Laura. Could I just ask one more question? And particularly, I'm interested in this distinction between lived experience and professional experience. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so lived experience is, looking at a particular experience of a phenomena. Professional experience is a particular role. And although the differences within the sessions and the way you run the sessions aren't very different, there's differences in what students want to get out of these sessions. So I used an example in a discussion with a colleague earlier today, and it was around a police officer coming in and doing a session. Students are going to be engaged before they even walk into that session if they have an interest in pursuing a career in policing. So you've naturally got a captive audience there that are interested in what you have to say because they see it as a networking opportunity or an opportunity to, explore a role that they may be interested in doing. If you've got someone in that room that's actively anti-police, which is a fair enough perspective to have on policing, they're going to be actively disengaged from the get-go because they view it as a networking opportunity and they view it as sitting and existing within this employability strategy, which is around, career seeking and finding roles which fit within your subject or your discipline. Whereas lived experience exists sort of beyond those realms of traditional strategies within higher education and beyond those realms of traditional curriculums. It's almost seen as, a little something extra that is going to supplement your learning and make your learning much more engaging and applicable. So it's less about the sessions themselves and the distinct differences between them, but actually the motivations from students to go to those sessions and the outcomes in terms of practitioner-led sessions being geared towards those graduate outcomes that are measurable, that are distinctive, and then those more holistic outcomes around challenging ideologies and, supplementing traditional learning with that reality and that lived experience perspective.
Thank you so much. Really, very, very clear. And I think an important distinction, and I guess having both of them, say in a particular module, can really sort of enhance the impact of that module. A couple of questions have come in. So, Joe, thank you for your question, Joe. How do you manage students who may respond negatively to, say, a former prisoner coming in, etc.?
So I think it's about managing the room, and as lecturers and facilitators, we naturally manage classrooms of students every day. My experience has been that students have been curious, but never offensive or negative towards lived experience individuals. People have put across a critical opinion or challenged a particular discussion within a session, but it's always been within a sensible way and not an offensive or negative way. If that was to happen, I think it's just about being really clear about managing that room, managing expectations. Those expectations are addressed before the session, before the speaker gets in that session, in terms of, not being offensive, being, sensible in the questions you're asking, not, discriminating against people. And that falls within that wider equality, diversity and inclusion policy here at Suffolk. So the student would be managed according to that if it did occur in the classroom. Yeah. Yeah,
thank you. And thank you for your question, Joe. Christian has asked, would you include students as speakers to present a session of their lived experience on a relevant topic?
That's a really specific example of how lived experience could be used, Christian. I would say if it's a student within that cohort, and at the same institution, probably not. And that's more of a safeguarding thing. I'd be quite concerned about, firstly, that student being able to connect their learning to their own experience, and the risks of that being quite uncomfortable for the student, for the speaker, and also just in terms of the dynamics between that student cohort. Personally, I don't think it would be appropriate, particularly if their lived experience was of being in a marginalised group, such as a former sex worker, or someone who used to use substances or has been in prison. However, I think naturally some lived experience discussions happen in the classroom, and we get those disclosures as educators and as session facilitators, where a student will say, oh, actually, something like that's happened to me in the past. And I think those disclosures can be helpful ways of making sense of knowledge, providing that student's happy in that moment to disclose it. However, I probably wouldn't design an entire session around a person's particular disclosure of lived experience.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Christian, for your question. Joe has asked, how can we ensure lived experience contributors are not used in a tokenistic way?
Great question. So, Joe, do you mean, I just want to make sure I get the context of this question right. So part of, ensuring we don't use lived experience contributors tokenistically, I would say paying them where possible is a really important way of assigning the same value that we assign to professionals, and that we assign to occasional lecturers when they come in and deliver sessions. So I think there's something about payment where appropriate and where possible within that individual circumstances, and also ensuring that when we're asking someone to share their lived experience, it's something they're safe and comfortable to do so, and it's something that is meaningful to the student's learning experience and not just plonked into a curriculum as a token of we're including it, which is why actually, since I've been thinking about lived experience, I think it's quite nice that it doesn't exist within a higher education strategy, and it exists more holistically out, on the edge of a traditional curriculum, because you don't have outcomes that are tied to it, and you don't have expectations tied to it, and actually that creates space to really focus on how to make it meaningful. So lived experience is not something I rely on for every session and every different topic that I teach, but if I think it's going to be a valuable contribution and it's going to give the students more than I can give them and more than academic discourse can give them, then it's something I'll explore doing, but it's not something that is always appropriate with every topic and every subject matter.
Thank you. So it almost maintains that authenticity. The grasps of neoliberalism hasn't got it just yet.
It feels safe now.
Yeah, Joe sort of clarified, in professions where we have to have user involvement, I sometimes feel participation can be tokenistic and not particularly meaningful, i.e. a tick box exercise. And I think that you kind of just explored that a little bit there as well.
Yeah, and it's that notion of have to have. I think that's what runs the risk of making the sharing of lived experience tokenistic. It's that measurable outcome applied to it. It's that tick box, inclusion of it in the curriculum that can make it quite tokenistic and can reduce that meaning, because it's not authentic, and it's not, a process or a decision by a facilitator or a lecturer who's thought, what, actually getting someone in who has experienced this firsthand is going to be far more meaningful than the students reading about it in a book chapter. So yeah, it's about keeping that authenticity around lived experience and doing it because of a genuine feeling that it will be more meaningful than a traditional way of learning about a topic.
Absolutely, and I think as you've spoke about in with great clarity, it's almost that the role of the facilitator the lecturer to connect those lived experiences to what students are, their requirements in that particular module in terms of assessment as well. And you kept saying that phrase of the penny, almost making sure that penny drops, was quite profound as well.
And that's our job as facilitators, to make that penny drop. And that's why we include certain guest speakers, we include certain topics, we create certain assessment tools. It's to try and make that penny drop, which I think is so important in all aspects of higher education.
Absolutely. Well, Christian's just asked a follow-up question. We can maybe squeeze this one in before 5 o'clock. So following up to my question, I guess there are other safer topics / experiences that students can share, such as being a school nursery teacher or having a disability. But I guess that can be included in the teaching and learning experience in other ways.
Yeah, so I guess that goes back to, being in those discussion-based sessions. Seminars are a really good example where people do make disclosures about, when I used to work here, or, my, experience with this particular reality. And that lived experience learning, happens naturally through those seminars. I've had students disclose in seminars that they've been to prison, or they've been in a psychiatric unit, or they have a certain disability, or they have a certain experience, and it's been a meaningful, powerful discussion in a seminar. But that's someone deciding to contribute of their own volition, and being able to burden the consequences of making those disclosures in an open environment that may not be a safe space. I think it's a very different dynamic when, as a lecturer, you have sought out someone to come in for the specific reason of sharing their lived experience, rather than it occurring organically within your student cohort, which can be just as meaningful, but needs safeguarding because these people are still students.
Thank you, and thank you, Christian, for your questions. Laura, that's been a really powerful hour presentation there and discussion. So thank you so much for sharing your research and how you put it into practice. I do hope you're going to write up that as a study. It would make a really nice journal article. So thank you to everybody who's attended this afternoon, but also mainly thank you to Laura for sharing your expertise on this topic. Before we say goodbye, I'd just like to signpost you to the next webinar session, which will be delivered by Javiera Atanas, and the title of that talk is Governed by Numbers, a Critical Approach to Data in Education. The link to sign up has just been posted in the chat, so please do sign up. Thank you, Laura, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.